So, hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani, and I am so honored to be here with the filmmakers of a film called A Place Among the Dead. I'm here with Juliet Landau and Deverill Weekes. Juliet is the director, the star, the writer, and the producer. I think she probably did everything other than craft services, and for all I know, maybe you did that too. And Deverill Weekes is the writer and producer, and Juliet's husband. And so they are a team in every possible way. What is brilliant, and all of you know that we often call the narcissist the emotional vampire. That's a theme that's often used. Well, here's the brilliance here, is A Place Among the Dead uses the vampire as the perfect metaphor, as the ultimate narcissist. And sort of it's that lurking, unseen kind of vampire. And I have to say, when I watched it, I thought, I've always used that term emotional vampire, but they really nailed the impact, the lifelong impact that exposure, especially to a narcissistic parent, that impact that it can have on people. And we now know, sadly, these conversations about narcissism are more relevant than ever. I've never seen this done in such a skilled way in cinema, in film. So thank you so much for talking with me. I mean, you know, I love seeing you, and we keep counting the days till we can actually sit across a table from each other in the same room.
Oh my
But
God.
I know I have explored, like I've talked about narcissists as emotional vampires. I've talked about that idea that you really do a brilliant job, you know, in the film with of the voice in your head that never goes. And you know, I always think about the person who had a narcissistic parent, and it's a really important day for them. I don't know, they're taking an exam, or they're giving a lecture, or they're doing, they're going to give a performance or start a new business. And they keep hearing that voice. You have no right to do this. Who do you think you are? Are you out of your mind? Like, really, really? Like, they're going to catch you. You're going to be found out. And like these muttering voices. And oh my gosh, you so captured that in the film. I want to understand though, because there were so many ways you could have told this story. Okay. Why did you use this metaphor of the vampire?
Well, for a number of reasons. First of all, we wanted to make an entertaining movie, and we
Mm-hmm.
thought this would be a good way to do it. Also, you know, I have a history. I was on Buffy the Vampire Slayer,
Yeah.
and
Mm-hmm.
all of the talent: Gary Oldman, Ron Perlman, Robert Patrick, Lance Henriksen, Joss Whedon, best-selling authors Charlaine Harris and Anne Rice, both appearing for the first time ever in a movie. They all have ties to the vampire legend and have created in that universe. I also wanted to lull the audience into a sense of safety so that we could explore unsafe and radical ideas. And like you were saying, we thought that the vampire was the perfect metaphor for the ultimate narcissist,
Mm-hmm.
a being that drains you all for its own volition,
Yeah.
has no concern about you know, what the other person's needs, and it also is you know, often mesmerizes, can be charismatic. If it's not a
Can't stand mirrors.
can't stand mirrors and self-reflection.
But here's what I really find. One thing that's so interesting to me about the vampire is the idea that they suck from other people to maintain the grandiose illusion that they will live forever.
Yep.
Yeah.
You know, and that really what to me is the vampire, right? But they don't really live a whole life, right? They're these shells. They're not real human beings, but they get to live forever, which isn't that the ultimate grandiose dream?
It is.
And Joss has that line where it's about, Joss Whedon has that line about not fulfilling the contract of life.
Interesting.
They don't fulfill that contract that is life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's so wild. Whenever I talk to you, Dr. Ramani, you say these words that take me into a very emotional place. And I wanted to share something that was really a kind of profound moment for me in my life. Was we were in England, and Juliet met my father. And my father was the main narcissist in my life, and he hated Juliet. I mean, he really had. Juliet wasn't well, and we were in a car, and she was trying to sleep, and he kept turning the music up. And I was like, David, turn the music down. And he kept turning it up. And what was staggering was that Juliet voiced what I had felt all my life. And where I think we have been very lucky is I met Juliet's father and was repulsed, and mother, and was repulsed literally like, I never want to speak to those people again. And I think we've been very lucky in that sense. But it was interesting how David...
It sometimes helps to have a witness in a certain way. I think,
right.
like, when you grow up in a certain situation, it feels to you normal, to some degree.
Correct.
And so what was interesting with Dev is that we went and he told me all these really terrible things. And he had been telling me for months. And every time he'd tell me particularly horrendous thing about his father, he would say afterwards, but he's so sweet. And then he would say this another horrendous thing, particularly horrendous, and he would say, but he's so sweet. So we went for a walk just after I met him, and I hadn't been feeling well, and he said some other story, which was again horrendous, and he said, but he's so sweet. And I said, you keep saying he's sweet, but you haven't told me one story that is at all sweet. Is there, like, can you think of a story that's sweet? Because why do you keep saying he's sweet? And then I remember that you paused and then you said, wow, that's really something. Like, he was always justifying that he was a sweet person, even though none of his actions actually were sweet.
But then but you're also at that moment when someone brings you that, I'm sure when you bring that truth to someone, they are then confronted with, do I accept this and move forward, or do I reject this and I never go back to it? And I felt
you go back to it.
I felt at that moment, and I think Juliet would say the same thing, that we were safe enough to go, yeah, that's true. I've got to let this go. And the tragedy of that, because those relationships are vampiric. They are continually draining you. All they do is drain and take. They have, and then
but the thing that I think is interesting is that, and that's some of the thing when people see the movie and start talking about it is, truth can be really painful and hard to reconcile. And then you deal with the loss really of what never was. It's not a loss for what is, it's what never will be and never was. And you start having to confront that, but truth is always so much better. And it's a place to build from and build your life from, because living in the denial of it is exactly what Dev's saying. It's like you're in this cycle that is so draining, and basically you're just using up your time on this planet.
Correct. But it's so, again, what the pattern you were describing with Dev is like, my father, terrible thing, and he's so nice, and terrible thing, and isn't he sweet? And that pattern you're talking actually is the name. It's called cognitive. It's called cognitive dissonance. It's our minds have a very hard time keeping two things that don't fit in place. The classical telling of that is Aesop's fable of sour grapes, where the fox sees the grapes, and when he realizes he can't jump high enough to get them, he's like, oh, those grapes must have been sour, right? Well, this is a justification in the other direction, is this is a horrible person. The way they're treating me is horrible. They're my father. As a child, you had to make the pieces fit. So that those words of, and he's so sweet, but he's nice, was almost like the voice of the vampire in the film. It just doesn't stop. Like you were saying it out loud. You were literally saying it out loud, Dev, but for most people, it's happening in their head, or they feel that constant constriction of knowing that they're about to go into something terrible. And then that one nice thing they do, whoever the narcissist does the one nice thing, I don't know, they give you a gift or something. And so many people say to me, I wish they wouldn't even do that one nice thing, because that's what's turning this into a nightmare.
But that's the game.
That's the game. And that's the thing that, we when we were talking about the voiceover in the film, we really wanted to look at the internal monologue that and we said, Deb and I always talked about going to movies and never seeing a voiceover that sounded remotely like the inside of our heads and the thoughts that were running through. And we started thinking about, well, where do those thoughts come from? And you make these agreements growing up, and then you continue those voices in your head, and very often they're not your true authentic self.
Right.
They don't actually, they lead you toward making destructive choice after destructive choice, which my character is doing in the movie. And
correct.
In life, we're not doing anymore, but we did do that for a long time. And that was something that we wanted to explore and look at and really talk about, because you are sort of primed to do that. And it's that thing, that replaying of the unwinnable parent and going after over and over. And it gets worse like we found with our relationships and everything that we were doing, it kept getting worse and worse and worse when it was being unaddressed, when we weren't looking consciously at what we're doing.
And something you said to us in one of our conversations, it really blew our minds, was why they're so attractive. Why are they so attractive? And I think you said it's like the child that has a tantrum in the playground, where all the other children are trying to obey the rules. The narcissist does anything they want whenever they want.
Correct. And they get away with it.
And it's appealing.
It's charismatic, it's appealing, but it's almost like there's something otherworldly about it, like you're going to get away with this, and again and again and again. And as a child, there's a sense of, you're almost looking awestruck to say, are they going to get the consequence that I'd probably get? And when they don't, the child doesn't say, well, you're a little entitled 3-year-old. They'll say, wow, that's impressive. It's impressive. And I think that it starts then that I think at some level, children are almost impressed by the person who gets away with it. And even as adults, we watch them throw tantrums. Right. And they get away with it. And I think we remain kind of awestruck that they actually got away with that. Now, I think that people who are survivors of this realize that that's not cool, but it also again, one other thing we had talked about with your film was, your film does something so interesting, is that we remember, and we talked once, I think we were just chatting in the summer, and we had talked about that, we were talking about the Mr. Rogers film. Remember? And how I said I loved Mr. Rogers and actually loved all the films, but there was one thing I hated. And it was that idea about, here was the character in that film who had this deeply, deeply toxic, narcissistic father. Yes. And he was being encouraged to go and forgive this, and they'd have their big, happy forgiveness moment. And I remember feeling sick when I watched that. And you did too. Yeah. And a lot of people, I say, like, you're so cynical, Ramani, but not at all.
I think was it called A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, or what?
Something like that, yeah.
Something like that. Yeah, the thing that was so interesting about that movie is we had the same experience watching it, because the girlfriend in the movie keeps saying it's his duty to go and be around this person who's been so toxic and taken so much and been so awful, it's what you were talking about, where there's like one narrative that we're supposed to be, that's the only way. And there's certain things in life that I feel are unforgivable. I think, child molesting is unforgivable. I think there's certain things, and if it helps someone to forgive, and that's one path, that's fantastic. But there are other things that ways of coping that work. Like, I don't think that character needed to show up for that person who had never shown up for him, and to have 1 minute of something that was basically a fake moment,
Because they're frightened of going to hell. I mean, they're frightened of being in whatever hell is, because they know they're going there. I don't believe that exists, but I also think the other thing is, it's an elective choice that can be made consciously, then choose that. What I think is awful is that it is almost written that you have to do that, and you don't have to do that, and it doesn't mean you're going to have a horrible life if you don't resolve. You might have a better life if you don't resolve. You probably will, in fact, have a better life.
Right, because the thing of the resolve is that let's say, first of all, you probably won't get the resolve you want, but even if you get the resolve you want, so you've had that character had, 40, 50 years of like totally terrible behavior, and then a few minutes of saying something. And so what does that really mean? It doesn't mean anything, right? I mean, really.
And I think it's really what gives you the best life.
Exactly.
Well, I think, but what you did was you took the risk here, right? In Hollywood, you said, you don't have to forgive the parents. You said that in a film, and we never, ever see that. Like, it wasn't like she went through the whole vampire experience and then she came out of it and went and visited her parents and everything was okay, which is usually how Hollywood would tell that story. And I can imagine a bunch of network bosses saying, yeah, we don't like the ending of this movie because people aren't making nice with their parents.
Right.
It is there is such a threat that's hanging out there when people don't make nice with their parents. And I'm sure you've had this experience, regardless of the film, where you have been brutally honest about the experiences you've had with your respective parents, and people might have been very put off by what you were saying. Like, almost like they would hold back from you, like, ooh, please don't, piss on that sacred idea of family and parents and respect. And you'd really get some pushback you use the film to push back on that, but I imagine you've run into that in your own lives.
Yes, but you know what's interesting also is that what I found was, and obviously not with every, you don't talk to everybody. It depends on the nature of the relationship in terms of how much information you divulge on any subject, right? But what I found very interesting is that when you do speak honestly and truthfully, basically about like, well, that for me would be a lie. It wasn't really what the relationship was. So this is what it was. It's a shame that's what it was, but that's just the truth of who these people were. There's something interesting in that a lot of people say, I had a horrible, I've just never talked about it. Like so many people, even before the movie, would say, oh my God, I felt completely, I had to overcome that, this relationship in my life. And so that was very interesting to me, and telling before we made the movie that it was like, oh, people actually do want to talk about this. A lot of people.
I think what would be an interesting thing to do, and maybe we could all do it together, would be to go into a position and say, how do we as people in society, how do you resolve the choice you make? Like, you've invested in someone as a viewer. You may be like Roman Polanski, say, like, great director. He did some really awful things. How do you, now you have to resolve that you don't get to just say he's amazing. Morally, I have to resolve with that in myself, and I have to make a choice about that. As long as I make it consciously, then that's up to me. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I think that the challenge is when it comes to narcissistic relationships, a lot of this choice isn't being made as an above the line decision.
No.
So I think that it's the person being able to say, this person is my father. They have the psychological damage they have enacted on me is bottomless. I carry this pain in me every day. I mean, Dev, you said it beautifully. Like, there's not a day you don't wake up and it impacts you from the moment you woke up. And if you didn't grow up this way, it wouldn't have been this way, but it is this way. And so you know all of this, and yet at the same breath you can say, and I'm going to have to figure out the workarounds because I still want to spend time with the other people in that family network, but it's all done intentionally. That's why I've always said, I mean, I don't preach no contact as a singular solution. That would be very arrogant of me, because I understand this is much more complex than that. I think that's one of many options. And I have to say, no contact is probably the best option. You know, it's probably the top gold level option. It's almost like you're a doctor saying, okay, we have this medicine that's going to work perfectly. Then we have all these other medicines. No contact's the best medicine, but it's not something that everyone can get.
No, but you know, what's interesting is what you were saying is it is the way that you're talking about the Hollywood narrative, and is that it is good to have it known that it is an option. That it is something that does work for people, and it is okay for people if they want to.
If they want to,
for that, and and totally not. It does. They don't have to opt for that, but it know that that it can be very helpful in terms of a life experience getting way better. It's, that isn't explored usually. It's sort of like, oh, we can't really talk about that even as an option, right?
And I think there's this interesting thing that happens. There was this beautiful woman who shared this story about how her partner had been driven to suicide by his narcissistic mother because he was finally disengaging with her, literally with this person.
So because of the movie, she actually wrote and said that the movie really helped her, and that she sort of understand what had happened, and one of the things when we were talking afterwards with the audience, and she was sharing this experience, and that she's come to some subsequent screenings, was that she was saying, we ended up saying, well, it's interesting that she sort of tightened the screws on her son, seeing that he had a sort of escape route with her, was probably her behavior got amped up more and more and more because she was feeling threatened that she would have less control over him.
But here's the thing. This lady understood it. She knew it. And there was a moment, and Juliet was brilliant with this, I felt, where she almost started defending the mother. And Juliet was like, don't do that. Just stick with it, because that's what it really is. You don't have to try and justify the mother. Just sit with it. And I think there's something exceptionally painful, and that's why I think Hollywood always tries to have that narrative.
Correct.
Because it doesn't want to just go, and that's why I think it is evil. I think that's what, because it's so malignant, it's so dangerous, it's so hurtful, and there is no answer to it than what it is.
But one other thing that's interesting in terms of what we were talking about right at the beginning of this segment in terms of the voiceover is when we were doing research about this, and one of the things that people have been relating to, even if they come from the most healthy, stable, loving backgrounds, is that we found that 80% of the voices in everyone's minds, or the thoughts running through their minds, are negative. And that's an astounding number. And when you just talk to, you know, we've been having these discussions in the screenings, and when you talk to people, even if they're like, oh yeah, no, I came from the Mayberry or whatever kind of background, or Norman Rockwell, and you know, things were good, but they still, I said, well, how do you talk to yourself? And they're like, I usually say like, oh, you're so stupid, you made the worst mistake, like derisive, horrible. And it was like, well, if we could as people minimize that even by 20%, right? And
Correct.
be at 60%, think how much, first of all, freer we would be, and how much more we could actually contribute if we weren't just,
Correct.
right, you know?
Is it usually with a narcissist, are they usually putting themselves in a position of power when they strike out with those words?
Of you're not enough, or you know, who do you think you are, and all that. No, what it is that they're putting themselves in a position, yes, of power, of dominance. And why do they need power and dominance? To manage their own sense of insecurity, right? It's like pulling a suit of armor around them, because they always feel so threatened. And what they find is that when they can keep people down, when they can keep people below them, that there's a sense of false security they're able to maintain, because they're up here looking down on them. And what we know is that the most courageous, the strongest, healthiest people are able to be at the same level as everybody, and they don't need any kind of hierarchy.
Right,
But that obsession with power, dominance, and control is always the sign of a weak psyche and a weak mind.
Do you think they're like pimps?
So if they're pimps, then who are they pimping out? The people, like, you know,
other people.
Other people. Yes. Well, I think that what's interesting is viewing them as pimps is interesting, because I think what they do is they do view people as disposable, and they do view people as objects, as commodities of sorts, right? So they're only really interested in a person when they're convenient for them, or when they're bringing them supply. Right. So it might be they keep someone around because they're a yes man or yes woman, and they're always complimenting them, or they keep them around because they do things for them. And in fact, you'll notice for narcissistic people, almost all of their relationships are transactional. They don't have friends. They have trainers and coaches and therapists and hairstylists and makeup artists, and everyone's on the payroll.
Yeah.
You know, and there's a reason for that, because then the narcissist feels in total control of those relationships, right. You know, pulling off the $100 bills and then feeling in total control of that relationship, versus the narcissist actually having to be valued for themselves. We all all of us forget this, because they so dominated and controlled our lives that we tend to forget that they're more insecure than us.
Right. It's interesting too, because in the voiceover, one of the dialogue the parents say is, be our slave, right? Mm-hmm. We would like it if you were crippled, basically, right? Mm-hmm. Like they're basically saying, and it's sort of what you're talking about in terms of the subservience.
Correct. I think slave is actually a very, very appropriate term there. What is a slave? It's chattel. It's human ownership. And that's what it is for a narcissist. It's human ownership. And where that gets the most pronounced is with a narcissistic parent who doesn't view themselves as a custodian of a child's psyche and soul, but they merely view the child as an extension of themselves. And the minute that child becomes inconvenient, they have no problem with cruelly pushing them aside or rejecting them.
Oh, well, can I share something?
I was going to say something about that Dev said with, which I was going to say off of that, in terms of a relationship that Dev had prior. Is that what you were going to talk about?
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, that you know, where he was with someone who had this personality type. And what was interesting is a friend said to him at the time, you know, if you get off this train, there's 1,000 people lined up after you. Like they'll just pick the next person. Mm-hmm. And it's true. And what's been interesting in the talks that we've had with the film, there's one gal that was sharing, she didn't realize what had happened. She's been out of a relationship for 3 years, and she was talking about that she finally feels like she's regained a sense of herself. And one of the things that she related to so strongly in the film was some of the way that we dealt with the camera work, because we did a lot through my character Jules' perspective, and we really wanted to feel what it feels like when you're in the orbit of a narcissist, and how it can be really disorienting and destabilizing, and that when you start to when the character is getting nearer to the you're not ever sure if he's a vampire or a serial killer, but regardless, it's the same traits. But when this character is getting closer to that character, we often use blurs, and we used static and stuff, and it was that feeling of losing yourself, bit by bit by bit, and having no sense of the ground, really. And so what was interesting is that she was talking about, like, in seeing the movie, she went, oh my God, that's what was happening in that relationship. That's why I'm only now just sort of being able to see with clarity now that I'm not around it. And then Dev told the story about, like, his friend saying there's 1,000 people, and she said, exactly, like, I was the love of his life, supposedly. Within 2 weeks, he had a new person, and he was doing the exact same MO. And that's when she didn't realize the terminology. And she was like, it's so helpful to actually know that I'm not alone. I'm not crazy. And what I've experienced is actually, like, all these people have gone through this. I wasn't a nut to sort of give up those pieces of myself.
What is the step from, so narcissist is a level, the level beyond
like
that,
sociopathy, does it is
it something you can step into, or is it something that you either are or you're not, like someone who can become a murderer?
Or just even lack of empathy, like, where is a line? We're interested in, like, obviously sociopaths have narcissistic qualities because they don't have empathy, like, where it's an extreme, it's sort of like close in the line of.
So to me, a big core difference, when we get into the realm of sociopathy and psychopathy, there's a discontinuity. They have a lot of the same top notes: the lack of empathy, the entitlement, the desire for power and dominance, the manipulation, the arrogance, the exploitation. Those things they have in common. The big difference, though, is the narcissist is inherently insecure. Okay. And their whole lives are organized around protecting their fragile egos and the fear, the threats in the world. The psychopaths in particular, and a little bit the sociopaths, but definitely the psychopaths, fear less. Zero fear. Their nervous systems don't get worked up when so that's why they're great hired assassins. That's why they can kill someone and go and have lunch with their friends afterwards. I mean, and really not miss a beat. If a psychopath senses that people are closing in around them, like you've done something wrong, then they actually stay very cool. But if a narcissist senses people that are figuring them out, and they actually start trembling, because they're about to be found out. And for a narcissist, the ultimate fear is that their deficits will be aired publicly. The psychopath doesn't have that fear. The sociopath is a little bit different. The sociopath is not as coolly efficient and cunning and calculating as the psychopath. The sociopath has a bit more of a sloppiness. It's the psychopath almost doesn't even understand why we have rules and ethics and norms. They're like, well, it would be a lot more efficient if you just let me kill him. Like, they don't even get that. But for the sociopath, they know that there are rules, and they just don't feel that the rules apply to them. Again, I almost want to say there's a bit more of a sloppiness to them. Sociopathy is a term that's actually more of a sociological term, or a criminal, or they use it in criminology more. But the psychopathy term and the narcissism term, definitely in the province of psychology, I tend to prefer that distinction, because the sociopathy term, a lot of people use it, but it doesn't have the meat. And so the discontinuity between narcissism and psychopathy is that fragile core self. That's what the narcissist has. The psychopath does not have that. No. That's probably closer. And then malignant narcissist is sort of the last stop on that train, where you have that person who's exploitative and somewhat sadistic and paranoid and Machiavellian and all those things that are a malignant narcissist, but they still do have some of that core insecurity. Psychopath doesn't have that. It's a more rare phenomenon, psychopathy, for sure. The narcissism, which is definitely much more prevalent. So that's what we'd be seeing in there. Now you're asking me, would a narcissist always be able to commit murder? I mean, if you want to argue it philosophically, I suppose we all had that capacity. But I would say that with a psychopath, you would be more likely to see a planned kind of a murder. With a narcissist, you'd probably be more likely to see a crime of passion, because their insecurity snaps, right? And that they might just get into this sort of this place. But for a psychopath, they may also kill someone because they tried to dominate them. Right? They do not like that. They do not like when somebody tries to lord over them. Like they are the lord, you know, of all of it and the master of all of it. So they will not tolerate that. So it's not even a snap as much as, seriously, you think you're going to get one over me? Done. And, you know, and that would even, and we're talking about a big, you know, this big crime, like a murder, even things like theft or ethical issues like infidelity. The psychopath wouldn't even break a sweat when it comes to infidelity. They'd be like, oh, I'm gonna bang anyone who I want. Like, why are we even having this conversation? The narcissist knows it's a bad. And so if they even sense people would say, ooh, that's the guy who cheated on his wife, they do not like that shameful characterization. And a psychopath wouldn't care if people viewed him or her as the person who's cheated on the spouse. So there's a nervous system difference.
That's interesting. That makes a
Yeah.
lot of sense. It also makes sense that it's more like the narcissist also is more concerned about what others think.
Yeah.
And that's
correct. And the
right?
psychopath doesn't care.
Doesn't care. It doesn't
No.
matter.
They don't care as long as unless it cuts into them getting power. So they may try to do some, but it's all about power. So we're going to have to continue this conversation because there's so many more great things to say. Again, I am Dr. Ramani, and most of you know to find me here on YouTube, but I also, you can come to my website, drramani.com, and there you can see a lot more seminars that we do and books I've written and all of that. And then to Juliet and Dev, I know people want to know, where can they find this movie?
Yes. Okay. So we're on Lumley Theaters in the US on the virtual platform. And so anybody in the US can go see it there. We also are going to be opening worldwide on February 1st. And then we've been having and are continuing to have special screening, interactive virtual events that are worldwide, have been so profound and beautiful. And you can find out about all of those things and get tickets at our distributor's website. They are Modern Films, and the movie's called A Place Among the Dead. So the link is modernfilms.com/A Place Among the Dead.
Great. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. This has been so fascinating.
Yeah, it is. Always these conversations. Okay.